director of the Institute of Tropical Forestry in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico. He told me not to tell you all of the incredible things that he's done, but I'll tell you that next meeting. And I'm very happy to have you here, and I also want to tell you he's my best friend. It's more fun to sit down and have a bowl session with Ariel than with anybody else that I know. So Ariel?
Yeah, but I don't talk as loud as Charlie. So I'll do my best. I hope you can hear me. This is the most complicated room I've ever been into. And I hope all this works, because what I'm going to do, we're going to talk about the tropics, we're going to talk about tropical forests. First, I want to give you a tour through the tropical forest, and then we're going to talk a little bit about people, what they do to the forest and what the forest does to people. And to do all that, I need to use two projectors, and that's where all this excitement will come into. I'm going to start with the right one, and that's what I wanted. See, this is like a satellite image of the planet. And the point about this image is that green is good, yellow is bad in terms of production. Most of the productivity, the high production systems of the world are in green, the low productivity systems are in yellow, and in the ocean, the low productivity systems are this color, and the clear colors are the high productivity system. The point about this slide is to show you that there's a lot of yellow and very little green, and when you look at the green in the world, most of it is in the tropics. And that's the reason why the tropical forests draw so much interest. In fact, half of the world's forests are in the tropics. And when you look at the tropics, people usually think of rainforests, and that's the general idea of what's there. But in fact, rainforests are a minority of the tropical forests. Most of the tropics are actually dry forests, and I'll show you pictures of both of those. And another interesting fact is that if you compare the kinds of forests in the tropics with the rest of the world, there's more tropical forest types or more forest types in the tropics than any place else in the world combined. So you're talking about an area where there's a lot of diversity of ecosystems. And you know, we use satellite imagery to arrive at another view of the tropics. I'm going to be talking about Puerto Rico, which is right there, you know, that little island next to the Dominican Republic. This is the mass of South America. And what this satellite image shows is it shows different water densities of water. And you can see coming out of the Amazon basin here, you see this red going all the way up to Puerto Rico. And this is fascinating because what we're learning is that the world is interconnected. You hear that all the time, but where is the evidence? And I always find it fascinating that Puerto Rico gets water from the Amazon River. And we also get clouds from the Amazon. So the Caribbean, which is all these little islands here, all the way to Cuba, next to Miami, Florida, up there, it's like a sink for the whole hemisphere, where you get converging climatic systems and you get converging oceanic systems. And so it's a place where there's a lot of action, a lot of biological action because of all these converging systems. And this is what people, you know, worry about in the tropics. It's called deforestation. You know, this one you can see the smoke still coming up. You know, people want to cut the forest and the forest gets converted to something else. And that's called deforestation. Deforestation is the issue that most people talk about when they're talking about the tropics. And we'll talk about deforestation in a while. Deforestation usually results in letting the land devastated, as you see here. The few plants that you see, they're left there because people like them. You know, if you like a tree, particular tree, they're left behind. But basically, this is the image of what's happening in a lot of areas in the tropics, that the forest is being converted to something else, and it ain't forest. So what happened to everything that was living in that forest? Well, people assumed that those species that were there were either extinct or in great difficulty. Now, the problem with that view that I just told you is that it is a very biased view of the whole situation, because the tropics, the changes in land use in the tropics is complicated. It's very complicated. Here you have, for example, here in the top, it says mature forest on both sides. And then you have secondary forests of different ages, and in the bottom you have permanent agriculture. And so each box is a different state in a complicated process that is called deforestation. So basically, when people see the mature forest converted, they think that what happens is that you convert a mature forest down to permanent agriculture, and we ignore all the boxes in between. We also ignore all the lines that connect those boxes. That is that you can maybe change a mature forest into a secondary forest, but then it goes back again. But we never talk about going back again. We only talk about in terms of what happens from the top box to the bottom box. The numbers that you see in these diagrams are millions of hectares per year. And the numbers that you see inside the boxes are millions of hectares. So basically, what you see here at the bottom, you see that 4.1, that would be 4.1 million hectares per year that are being converted to permanent agriculture. But you see a lot of question marks on the arrows going back up again. And that, ignoring those arrows, is deadly, as I will show you in a second. So we tend to simplify too much what's happening in this part of the world. For example, here is in the middle of San Juan in the 1970s. This is a housing development, you know, right, with waterfront property. You learn to swim early when you live here, because if you don't, you know, you're detritus very quickly. So you would think that, you know, these houses were located in a mangrove swamp, and the mangrove was deforested and occupied by people. But 10 years later, you remove the people, whoops, and there's the mangrove all the way back again. So here's an example of how deforestation was reversed. And so then the question is, how frequent does this happen in the tropics? Is deforestation a one-way process, or is it cyclical? A punchline that you all need to remember is that things are quicker in the tropics. All biological processes are quicker in the tropics. How fast? How much quicker? Well, in terms of productivity, nutrient cycling, those kinds of things, 10 times faster, easily. Tree growth, 10 times faster than what you used to do in the temperate zone. Okay? So how do you illustrate the quickness of a process? Well, I show it with the infrastructure, with our experience. This is a friend of ours going in the morning, you know, to do the rounds, to inspect a particular tropical area in the morning. He's coming back in the afternoon. Very fast rate of decomposition and deterioration of infrastructure. You need to do a lot of maintenance. So let's look at the tropics in more detail. We look at Puerto Rico. This is a shuttle image from the astronauts flying over the island. This island is 100 by 35 miles. 100 by 35 miles. Okay? In that island, there are the same number of tree species as you have between Florida and Alaska. All of North America, the same number of tree species that you have in North America, you have in that little island. So it gives you an idea of the diversity, the biological diversity in the tropics. The other thing that I want to tell you about Puerto Rico, so you understand what I'm going to be showing you, is that there are almost 4 million Puerto Ricans living in there. 4 million Puerto Ricans. If you do your math, you'll find out there's 1,000 of us per square mile. 1,000 of us per square mile. You know, in New York, there's probably, I don't know, maybe 200 per square mile, if that many. So it is an incredible human density. San Juan is over here. The Luquillo Mountains is over here. What we're going to do is we're going to go up these mountains here in Luquillo, and then I'm going to take you around here to this part of the island and show you different ecosystems to illustrate to you the diversity of forest types, the diversity of systems that we have in a place like this, which is typical of all tropical places. First of all, what you see here is an estuary. You know, you're used to thinking of Chesapeake Bay as an estuary. In the tropics, the estuaries occur in the mouths of rivers. When there's a dry season, you get sand deposited in the mouth of the river, so the river becomes sort of like a lake, and then you have estuarine conditions. That's where you get a lot of the reproduction of organisms. So estuaries and rivers go together in the tropics. Now, these the coastal zones of the tropics are not palm trees, like you might think. It's vegetation such as that one. And those are called sea grapes. And they produce grapes. They're nice to eat. And in the estuaries, you get mangrove swamps. This is a mangrove swamp, which is a system where trees grow in seawater. And that's very unique. You don't get that in the States. You don't get that in boreal zone. Because when you have seawater in estuaries, up north here, what you have is grasses, spartanas. But in the tropics, you get trees. And that tree that you're looking at there, by the way, these are some gigantic termite nests in the forest. You know, you film a lot of Tarzan movies through these things. It's like a jungle, and it's kind of fun to walk through it, but it's actually very difficult. Well, those forests, this is the same species. And this forest is older than the one I showed you before. This forest we age at 4,000 years old. And it's the same species as the one before. It's like the same species but growing as a dwarf ecosystem. And this is the same system again. Here's the stem, and all this is like the canopy of the same species growing under different conditions. So these species are very adaptable, and they can fool you. They can grow very tall, they can grow tiny, or they can grow pressed against the floor. But in all cases, you're looking at mangrove swamps growing in seawater. Just a bay with, behind the mangroves, usually, these are the mangroves, you get salt flats, as you do here, but if there's fresh water, then you get swamps, such as this tropical swamp, but those are not cypress swamps, they're different kinds of swamps. And the mountains, the forests, supposedly cover the island 100% when Columbus came in. Remember that 100% because I'll show you what happened afterwards. And you're going up the mountain, you always get big trees at lower elevations. You see a lot of color associated with fungi, in this case, decomposing wood. And this particular tree, the tai-tai, you know, this is one of our gigantic trees in terms of diameter, nothing like the sequoias, obviously. This is an island subject to hurricanes. But in the States, this tree grows as a shrub. In the tropics, it grows as a gigantic tree, which is something that happens a lot in many species that are small in the temperate zone. If they extend into the tropics, they get larger. And sometimes they look like they walk in the woods. This particular tree, where the last three slides is the same one, is a fascinating tree. You know, you can't kill it. They coalesce. They walk over the forest. They're very resistant to all kinds of damage. And you look at the slopes. I'm going to explain to you. You know, look how smooth that slope is. There's a reason for that, for the smoothness, because we're in the Caribbean, and you have trade winds that are always blowing. The Caribbean is a good place to go and do tourism because of the trade winds. It's always nice temperature. It's not like if you go to the Amazon where there's no wind and then you suffocate with the heat. That doesn't happen in the Caribbean. You have moderate temperatures because of those trade winds, and then the forest acquires this smooth canopy with emerging trees. Inside of that smooth canopy, you know, these are palm forests, and this gives you an idea how high the water gets when it rains. Because these are close to rainforest conditions. To have a true rainforest, you need in the order of 200 of inches of rain a year. 200 of inches of rain a year. How much is there? About 50? 40. 40. Gives you an idea of the level of water that we're talking about. And you can see, if you get on top of the hills and you can watch the water flow down, and you get particular species growing along the water courses. And inside the forest, it is a typical floodplain in the middle of a mountain. You get all kinds of interesting forms, geomorphic forms in this forest. And if you go up the mountains, then you get in what we call cloud forests. And these cloud forests, they occur all throughout the tropics, wherever you have the cloud condensation point, wherever the clouds touch the land, they come into the forest and they create these kinds of aspects. And it's a weird system because you see the roots of the trees, they're all in the surface. This is the wettest parts that we have in Puerto Rico, about 300 inches of rain a year. Notice that everything is covered with plants. They're called epiphytes. And all those plants, they take nutrients from the clouds. The clouds have 100 times more nutrients than the rainwater. Clouds are really concentrated food for the plants, so concentrated that the trees will make roots in the canopy, as you see here. And these roots in the canopy will intercept the cloud, get water from the cloud and nutrients from the cloud. These are really fascinating ecosystems, these cloud forests. And when you have landslides, in a place like that that rains so much, lots of landslides, you see the abundance of ferns. These are tree ferns. There's a person standing down here. These ferns are 30, 40 feet tall. And ferns are plants that colonize areas that get that have exposed soil. And again, as you look at the forest, this is one more time the smooth canopy. Which brings us to hurricanes. This is Africa right here, South America. There's Puerto Rico in there. One line for each hurricane in the last 100 years. And you see the hurricanes, they originate near Africa, they come like this and then they turn up north. They're dissipating energy. So when you look at the intensity of these hurricanes, how many of those there are, you realize that this has to be an important ecological factor. So let me show you now what happens when a hurricane hits the island. This is before the hurricane, right here. We're going to forget that one for the time being. This was a 4-hour event, 4 hours. The wind speeds over 100 miles an hour, and you can see there's no green now. Everything is burnt. Everything disappeared. And you can even see roads that we didn't know were there. And this happens to be an area that we're studying in some detail because this is what we call a long-term ecological research site. It's a place where scientists have been studying this for a long time before the hurricane. The hurricane came in, it's like an experiment. And now we can see what happens after the hurricane. So this is an experimental area which we call the Beasley watersheds. These instruments, we have been studying this place for everything that flows through here. We're measuring the water, the sediments, the nutrients, and there you have the forest before the hurricane. I'm going to show you 4 slides on the same place so that you see what happened. This is right after the hurricane. To convince you, someplace in here, see the equipment here? You'll see the equipment. It's the same creek, and now, right after the hurricane, oh my goodness, there's nothing alive here. But 3 months later, the thing starts to sort of pop up green everywhere, and then 7 months later, it's even more so, and 1 year later, it becomes a tangle. So here you're seeing the speed of recovery that these ecosystems have. 18 months later, you see the down wood here. It's hard to know that this thing had been devastated, and here's 5 years later. The difference between this picture and the first one, of course, is that this is still very dense. The forest is restructuring itself. But in terms of getting all the biomass back, all the plants, all the animals, after 5 years, if you do numbers, it's hard to tell the difference from before the hurricane. So in 5 years, you went from total devastation to a system that was well in recovery. That is high speed of movement. And here is an example of a mechanism. What we have here is the density of seedlings. This was the density of seedlings before the hurricane that we had counted. And these are 2 places in that area that suffered the effects of the hurricanes. So you see, that one had 55,000. These are seedlings per hectare of land. And so there was an incredible burst of reproduction. Compare that with Malaysia that has no hurricanes, where the seedlings more or less, they remain at densities maybe about, 5,000 per hectare. That's 10 times more. And then they, of course, decrease as the canopy covers, then they decrease in abundance. And here we're comparing 2 species. Cecropia happens to be a successional species, a species that likes disturbance. Dacryoides is a mature species, the one that is after the hurricane, in the mature phases. And again, you see the Cecropia just took off like gangbusters from almost 0 before the hurricane. You got to 9,000 individuals per hectare. and rapidly declined. As it declined, then the other species was taking over. It's kind of neat. And if you get up above and you look at it, what you see is that these holes that were created by the hurricane, and you see these species coming up and filling the holes. And Charlie, I was telling you about when you climb these trees, see how small those crowns are? The crowns are small because trees in this part of the world, they cannot afford to have big crowns because the wind will knock them off. So the trees are kind of narrow. And so everybody sort of trying to find space to grow in. Vines came in like gangbusters after the hurricanes and covered the whole forest with vines. I said, holy cow, the trees are not going to be able to grow through all those vines, but they did because the trees just break through. And just to show you one tree here that was clipped by the force of the wind. This is we're about 20, 30 feet up in the air because we're taking this picture from a tower. And so this tree had been lost all the crown, and this is a new crown that is developing. And look what, this is the same tree. It produced about 10 meters of new shoots within in 10 years. So even when you see the tree that gets chopped in half by the wind, these things have the capacity to come back up again, and that just gives you an indication of the power of regeneration that the system has. So we sort of have this little model that we made to sort of try to explain how this works. And so if you have a force like a wind, the first thing that you have is the canopy architecture that I mentioned to you. That smooth canopy is protection against wind, because the wind has to be very strong to break through the canopy. The canopy has a tendency to deviate the wind. And so that's like a resistance that it has. There's also physical modifiers to the wind, because if you're facing the wind it's one thing, but if you're protected by a hill, that's another situation. So depending upon where you're located, given the direction of the wind, and these winds are very direct because they come from a particular direction, so you could be either protected or exposed. But if the wind is strong enough, the canopy will get killed, as you saw, and then everything falls down, and you got consequences. You open up the canopy, you get more light, the temperature goes up, the cookies, the frogs die because they desiccate, the seedlings grow very fast, as I showed you. So you get a chance for recovery, which is like a feedback system, but a feedback system operating at the whole ecosystem level. And in this feedback system, you can have changes in species. As we saw, for example, the cecropias, which were not there before, are now very abundant, and it will take a while for the system to come back to the way it was before. Usually, we have estimated it takes 60 years for the forest to come back to what it was. And when you look at the frequency of these events, because they're well documented in the literature, you find that you get hit on the average every 7 years as well. So the forest has more or less adapted itself to recover the full growth in the time that it takes for the next hurricane to hit. So you got a cyclic. Yeah, for those of you like animals, you know, in these islands there's not big animals, but you know, we have boas that eat bats. That's a bat being eaten by a boa. These boas, they like to wait up in the entrance of caves, and as the bats fly out at night, let's say 300,000 bats a night, there'll be 30 boas, they eat 5 bats each. So you know, it's not bad for the bats, but it's great for the boas. I mentioned the termite nests, which are very important because in the dry forest, and I haven't shown you dry forest yet, it's coming up. In the dry forest, the decomposition of wood is by termites. Termites are extremely important for the functioning, the cycling in these ecosystems. So let's go to the dry forest, to this other side of the island. In the other side of the island, you have these beautiful blue waters because there's no rivers, and there's no rivers, there's no sediments. The waters are clear. If the waters are clear, then you got reefs. The best reefs are always in dry areas, so never go snorkeling in a wet area because all you're going to get is dead reefs, too much sediments in the water. Always go to the dry places of the world, in the tropics. That's where you have the reefs. And the reefs, of course, are spectacular. I'm not going to talk much about them. The ants are very important for the dry forest because what they do is they move seed around. And so it is very interesting that between ants and bats and birds, you move all the seeds all over this island. And this is very important, as you will see, in explaining what happened in Puerto Rico with those 4 million Puerto Ricans hacking at the forest all at once. And we grow our own eggs. It's an eggplant in the island. So, agriculture. You have to survive to live, and that's why a lot of people, when they talk about deforestation, they forget that there's people living in the tropics. And people in the tropics, they need two things like people everywhere else. They need food, and they need fuel. And before fossil fuels, and I know you heard all that there is to be talking about in fossil fuel in this class, but agriculture used to cover most of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico used to be an agricultural island. And so the whole island was deforested. And I mentioned to you that initially we were 100% forested. In 1950, 1960, Puerto Rico was 5% forest, 5 to 10% forest. We lost 95% of the forest in that island because of agriculture and because of fuel wood. Because if you don't have fossil fuel, what you do is you cut trees to make fuel wood. And it is the fuel wood that powers the cooking and the heating and so forth in the island. And when you have a lot of people, everyone jumping in the woods, together we wipe out the whole island. And so here's a town in Puerto Rico. It shows you how all the surroundings, all deforested, everything wiped out. This is in the middle of the island. And the island was completely deforested all throughout. I have a picture of the same town in the 80s. Something happened between this picture, there's a church, and that one, there's a church there.
Same church?
Same church, same town, same photo, 20 years difference. Something dramatic happened in Puerto Rico. And of course what happened was that we discovered fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are great because you don't have to go and cut the wood anymore. You know, you don't have to go and grow your food, you just bring it all in, and you pay for it in cash. And fossil fuel explains the growth network and the incredible urban growth that took place in that island. And now, instead of planting sugarcane or crop, we just plant houses. And we're planting houses everywhere in that island. And this is an image of the urban areas in 1994. The yellow are new urban areas between 1977 and 1994. So the dark parts of this image are the ones that are forested. And so you see here the national forest, and you see here sort of like the central part of the island where you have a lot of coffee plantations which are forested, and above you have the karst areas, they're forest, but the rest of the island, as you can see, is like we're planting houses all over the place. So this is the future, because it is now urbanized to such a degree that we can ask the question, what happens when you bring humans in close contact with nature? And will nature survive, or is it doomed? Well, look what we do to our tallest mountain. This is our tallest mountain. We just shave up 20 meters and put towers so we can all have cellular phones, FM stations, television stations, great communications in that island at the cost of the cloud forest, which used to be there. Is what we do to the rivers. You have to scrape it clean so that they can move water quickly because of all this urbanization. And this is what happens when it rains. This is right through the middle of the city of San Juan, through a botanical garden. The water is chocolate, and it ain't chocolate milk. This is just sediment and soil, refrigerators, cars, humans, everything gets flushed out of the urban system into the ocean. And it takes the houses along because you build the houses in the wrong place and you don't expect the river to get that high. Well, it did get that high, so you have to channelize the rivers. You pay $30 million to the Corps of Engineers to channelize this river, and then you give it to the Puerto Ricans to maintain the channel. And that's how we maintain the channel. You see, the whole forest is coming back in the middle of the channel. This is a concrete channel that the Corps of Engineers put in the south coast of Puerto Rico. But it costs $1 million or $10 million to maintain a year, and we don't have that kind of money. And so we just let it go. So when the next rainfall comes, the channel is useless because it's full of vegetation. And it takes all the energy first to get rid of all the plants. At the end, the channel is okay again because it flushes it into the ocean. In the meantime, it flooded everybody just like it did before. It's a lovely place. We get subsidies. We don't care. If you live in front of the ocean, you're a major. We want to make a very nice promenade because that gives me boats. Look, a promenade so that my people can have fun at night. And here, when the ocean comes up, there goes the promenade. Oh, wrong place. The management of nature becomes very important when you are living at high density in an island that receives heavy winds, that is in the front of the Atlantic Ocean, gets all these gigantic events that affect it, and you cannot have the majors dictate what happens because they usually don't understand. And the other thing that is, if you look at this picture, I don't know if you notice the ecological principle that I'm illustrating with this picture, but this is the south coast of Puerto Rico during the peak of a dry season. And look at the vegetation. The vegetation is all leafless, right? That's nature. Shuts down, waits for the rains. But look at all the green. Where's all the green? The green is in the city because the city doesn't know there's a drought. They're just pumping water like crazy because people get isolated from nature. And so the green then attracts what? Well, if you are a rat or a dog or a cat or any kind of organism, you're attracted to the city because that's where water is and that's where food is. And so wherever humans go, they create these oases for what is called alien species or exotic species. And we get into the next issue that I want to talk a little bit about is the issue of species in the tropics. And we have two big ones. We have extinctions and we have aliens. Aliens, strictly a function of human activity. Wherever humans go, humans modify nature, humans modify conditions, and they attract aliens. They follow us. They're part of our ecosystem. And so you cannot escape that simple fact. When it comes to extinction, I have to introduce you to the species area curve. There's only one law in ecology that we have numbers for and that we know a lot about. It's a relationship between area and number of species. It's called the species area curve. Area on this axis, number of species in that axis, and when you do that, no matter where you do it, any place in the world, you get the same curve. What changes is the slope of the curve. Sometimes it's very steep, sometimes it's very shallow. And so you get a family of curves, species area curves, depending upon conditions, depending upon what part of the world you're at. For your information, the steeper species area curves in the world are in the tropics. We have the most species per unit area than any place else. So if you do one in Syracuse, it'd be like this. Because you don't have too many species. That's why you can learn taxonomy here. And that's why I don't learn taxonomy, because they all look the same to me. There's too many of them. Now, what scientists have done is have taken, we don't know how many species there are in the world. There's no idea. The estimates go between 10 million to 100 million species. So we're really ignorant in the number of species. So what we do is we develop a model and we theoretically extrapolate species lost against deforestation using the slope of the species area curve. Now notice that it's percent of the number of species, percent of the initial forest area. The reason it's percent is because we don't know the rate of deforestation, we don't know the number of species. This is the neat thing about science. Even if you don't know, you can find out. And you can invent it. And that's what happens with this thing. So, if you assume that the species area curve relationship is very steep, then as you deforest, you say it's like going back in the species area curve, going backwards instead of forwards. So you get this relationship between deforestation and extinction. If on the other hand you're very conservative, you use a low slope and you go this way, and you also know that at 0 there's no extinction, and you assume that at 100 deforestation there's 100% extinction. And with a graph such as that one, that's how we estimate. That's how all these articles that you read in the papers and in the magazines and all the hysteria about extinction of species comes from. Now, here's Puerto Rico that I told you was deforested almost 100%. So it is a good test to see what happened there, because there's so many scientists studying Puerto Rico. We know the taxonomy very well. Well, how does Puerto Rico fit? Did we lose this percent, 40% of the species, or did we lose 90% of the species? For your information, if you know these names, Paul Ehrlich, he uses this curve. If you know the name Tom Lovejoy, he uses that curve. Nobody uses these curves. They like to use those curves because you get bigger headlines. With these curves, you can predict lots of extinctions. Here is then the answer to my questions about Puerto Rico. Well, in Puerto Rico, we didn't lose 90% of the species. We lose 80%, 40%, 50%, 20%? No. It turns out that most of the extinctions in the Caribbean do not exceed 10%, and most of them happened before deforestation. It happened when humans first came into the islands a millennium ago. With modern humans, Puerto Rico now has more species than ever. We have 30% more tree species, we have about 20% more bird species, we have more ants, we have more ferns, more orchids, we have more earthworms. Every group we have more because of the invasion of aliens that are creating new ecosystems. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But the other thing that curve fails to consider is that you can increase the number of species through succession. So if the forest is recovering, it accumulates species about a rate of 1 new species per year. And this is the natural forest succession. And for example, here is one of my students walking through a dry forest that was completely deforested 40 years before she made this walk. Her dissertation was to study the forest 45 years after total deforestation for 100 years. There were people living here for 100 years, then they abandoned it, and just like the mangroves that I showed you earlier, the forest came back, the species are there. So there's a resilience in nature that we need to take into consideration when we develop this model. This is a new forest. These are the aliens. The aliens come in places that are deforested, and they create forest conditions. And then once they create forest conditions, the birds and the bats and the ants, they bring in seed, and you replant a new forest. And when you replant a forest, you start at 0 in a deforested area, and you can pump up 1 new species per year, so that in 35 years you have 35 species of trees. So there are ways that you have managing the situation and getting the species back. Here's an example where an alien, the pine is alien, doesn't belong in the Caribbean, but it can grow in a deforested site. Once it grows up, it attracts the birds and the bats and the bees and all that stuff. Then they bring in seeds, and whoop, you get enormous biodiversity developing underneath. And we have seen this before. This is my Guatemalan shot. There were the Mayans. The Mayans deforested Central America. There were millions of them. Then the culture went down. The forest came over and completely covered the ruins. And now you see Harrison Ford going through the ruins, looking for the ark and stuff. Ruins that are now forested. So there's precedent in the world for forests coming back after total deforestation. And these are things that model that I gave you does not take into consideration. And these are the ruins of a sugar mill in Puerto Rico. Sugar mills were the center of our economy, and now they're abandoned, and the forest is coming back right through the ruins. And it's amazing, how the power of regeneration that nature exhibits. This is the national forest, the Caribbean National Forest. when we bought this land in 1936, the Forest Service. I worked for the Forest Service, I didn't say that. These lands were completely deforested at that time. So what we did is we got in local people that were doing agriculture, and we planted mahogany trees with their crops and told them, take care of the trees, you can keep your crops. When the trees grow too high that your crops will not grow anymore, we'll find you someplace else to live. And so we moved them to someplace else, and now you go to the national forest, the people are not there, this is a forest in that same area. It's a beautiful, diverse mahogany forest that Charlie goes there all the time. He also knows it was planted by the Forest Service, probably. Because we proposed to cut the trees for wood. Mahogany is the most expensive wood in the tropics, $4 per foot. And we had 10,000 people demonstrating. You can cut that because that's nature, that's virgin forest. Hey, I planted that 40 years ago. That forest is 40 years old. So you can create these forests. The tropical forest is a complicated system, but you can get it going through management. Humans can make a difference, what I'm trying to say. And this is how we do it. You know, we do it what we call adaptive management. In the tropics, things are so complicated. There's so many species that you have to be innovative, and you have to do management as if it was experiments. So you plan something, and then you do something, and then you check it out, see what happened. And say, whoops, I didn't do well. So you plan again, you do something else, and you check it up again. So research has to be part of management in these complicated tropical systems. And by doing so, you're not going to solve all the problems of the world in the first 10 years, but hopefully you're going to make progress, and you're going to do things. And we've shown in the island of Puerto Rico that nature and humans can live together, that there are ways of doing it, even though there's so many people there. I can still take you places where you think you're alone, in the wilderness. And yet, you cannot go more than 2 kilometers without hitting a road in Puerto Rico. And we have 4 miles of road per square mile of territory. That's about 10 times in the States. It's unbelievable. It's the future. Because in the future, as we project this human population that is going to be living in this planet, they say 10 billion people, you can do 2 things. You can put your head in the sand and pretend that you're not going to do anything. There's nothing you can do, as many people say. Or you can say, wait a minute, we can use the knowledge that we are generating to try to manage this thing, try to direct human activity so that it's compatible with biodiversity. And look at places like Puerto Rico, where it actually is compatible, assuming the oil continues to flow. Because we already know that without oil, we're going to destroy it. Now we know that. So
destroy nature.
Destroy the system, because you cannot sustain 4 million Puerto Ricans. And we have a big fight, and then maybe 20 Puerto Ricans will survive, and then see what happens. That's all I have to say.
Have you guys thought of an alternate plan besides cutting trees down to use for fuel?
But you guys, which guys?
Puerto Rico in general?
Puerto Rico is suicidal. We're having so much fun down there that we don't really think about those things. But after the hurricane Hugo, the planes did not land in the San Juan airport for 2 days, and of course ships couldn't get to the island. And let me tell you, the supermarkets emptied mighty fast. And it's scary to see how quickly we were out of everything. And we were shooting each other for ice. Think about that. Can you live without ice? I didn't realize ice was so important for our society. People were driving across the island because they heard they were selling ice over there, and using guns to get in front of the line to get to the ice. So there are. What this tells me is that island cannot sustain any reduction in the flow of fossil fuels to it. The big question is, how long do we have these fossil fuel parties? Your professor here thinks that it's running out, but we need to know. I think we need to know exactly so that you can plan. But it is not the role of Puerto Ricans, I think, to find out the alternative. We have nothing. We just have beach, water, and palm trees and rum and stuff like that. We don't have that. We we don't have the research power to develop a new alternative energy source. A lot of us are looking at solar energy as an alternative, but we depend on the technology that is developed in places like the United States.
Mary, that was a great answer. That's a great answer. Mary?
After you have deforestation in the tropics, do you run in danger of losing your topsoil at all before, a forest eventually does take place?
Well, it's funny because we had a student from California, Wendy Silver, as a Yale student at the time, she's a professor in California now. She actually deforested experimentally a few hectares because she left the roots on. And when you deforest, you don't take the roots out. When you the problems of erosion are very serious with construction. Remember I showed you that slide of the river, Chocolate River? That's urban construction where you take all the vegetation out without any sensitivity to the biological system. But deforestation in the tropics, I didn't mention this, is done for agricultural purposes. The reason people in the tropics cut the tropical forests is to grow food. They need food. And the problem is that when they cut a hectare and grow their crops, they can only sustain production for several years, have to abandon and go someplace else. And that kind of cycle of deforestation does not lose soil. It's very resistant. The kind of deforestation that loses soil is when you remove all the vegetation and then you leave it exposed, like with mining or with urbanization. Then you lose soil big time.
Mario, now wait a minute, you're saying something kind of astonishing, aren't you? You're not very worried about nature, it sounds to me. Why?
Because nature is more powerful than we give it credit for. I think sometimes I hear biologists talk about nature like nature is a wimp, and nature is pretty tough. Nature has seen all kinds of catastrophes before, and always comes back. The only thing is that we're worried about us. And so it could be that we're not in the next cycle, because there have been species that have been wiped out before that were pretty powerful themselves, like dinosaurs and stuff. But I think that humans, my view is that humans have technological knowledge, they have understanding, they can put it to work, and if we get ourselves into trouble, we can get out of trouble. There's problems with that, and because a lot of the problems are political, social, and cultural. They're not technical. When you get down to business and you try to solve problems, you always run into problems of socioeconomic problems, and that's where maybe the real difficulties are. But we should be worrying about those. I'm saying that from the natural point of view, we can engineer systems and we can develop ways of maintaining human activity with some kind of balance in nature.
So you're not worried about nature, but you're worried about us. Interesting.